Crotch cam. So if you go to www.youtube.com/users/gettroll/live,
no.
then that'll work.
Give me a short link and I'll do it.
Hello. I don't know if that'll work.
If it says you're live, you're probably live.
Yeah. Good start with Facebook.
I could have done many easy options, but no, I've chosen the hard route.
I hate that Facebook brought that out though. Everything is live
There we go.
streaming
I just want to check though that it actually has sound.
It's definitely live streaming because that was about.
It's because I'm actually has sound from my laptop. That's obviously why no sound was playing back. Hopefully the talk goes smoothly. This is just getting all the crap out of the way.
Do you like slides then? Because I'm going to use it tomorrow.
I do like it. Yeah, it's quite nice.
Because it's built on that open source JavaScript thing. What it's called? President.js.
Reveal.js.
That's a reveal.
Yeah, I think the dude who made that makes that as well.
I think it is. Yeah. It's like Drawdown, and they make a couple of mil a year just by licensing it for a Confluence plugin. It's like all of their income just comes from that. Because the actual Drawdown is open source.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I was quite surprised.
Probably explains the
Interface.
yeah.
Well, no, there were higher front-end developers on Hack and Use.
You need to get rid of users.
There's actually a user called Users.
No. Oh yeah. Who has 11,183 subscribers?
No videos.
Yeah, absolutely not.
There we go. Cool.
Right.
It's still slightly low bit crouch cam, but I think it should be fine.
Yeah, I'll be right. And then what I'll do is, if he wants to look at the slides, he can. Oh wow, we're actually. Yes.
Obviously, we
What I'll do is, if he wants to look at the slides. That's not going to get annoying.
That must be weird.
Well, you don't have to listen to it.
I know. Can you imagine? It was really annoying. I recorded myself last night, and I didn't really know what I sound like. And I listened back, I was like, is that actually how I sound?
You always sound higher pitched than you think you do.
So you said you're a cheap microphone as well. If you have a more expensive microphone, you sound more like you sound your head than you do.
Listen back, I was like,
Can we close that?
You always sound higher pitched than
Yeah, can we just get rid of the YouTube tab? That's really annoying.
yeah, okay, I'll get it.
Hey, did that just loop?
Can we just get rid of the oh, we'll be getting feedback from
Oh, well, yeah, feedback. Fuck's sake, it was getting. I was listening, I was like, I didn't just say that twice. It's confusing.
We probably won't start until about 7.
Yeah.
I think. So we usually have pizza first.
Sedate everybody.
yes.
Yeah.
So it's comatose and ready.
Yeah.
Just mention them here before we go or something.
How much is actually in the beer channel? I might actually join that API dev one.
Yeah.
To get started building it.
I'm joining the Fraser Burr has its own channel.
What's that?
In the place.
Is it?
Yeah.
Where?
Fraser Burr.
I thought it was somebody's name just taken a nick.
Leave it that for now. I can relax for a little bit.
Have you done a lot of that lately, Tom? Working with legacy applications.
Not nearly as much as when I was doing like the billing and the invoice and stuff.
Oh, I suppose.
Right now I'm working on all new stuff and it's great fun.
We have modern legacy.
Yeah.
Check the camera was pointed okay.
Sure, it's fine.
Yeah, you might want to put it
Before
closer
you
to
start
the...
doing the talk.
It's like the delay.
Go to like in 30 seconds.
that's fine. Obviously, they won't be able to see
Yeah,
the
the
text,
slides-
but
slides
that
are
the
up
slides
now,
are up,
but-
so that's good enough, I think.
All the pods are coming from some of the
Yeah, you were saying
buy
about
a
that.
really cheap camera.
Most iPhones are decent.
Appearance is down. Appearance is
I just can't believe
JVC.
how useful it is because
a tape camera, yes. Proper whole VHS tapes as well, not this many DV things.
So they said in Lord of War it's easy to smuggle weapons because the average JVC was the size of a bazooka.
You ready, Sam?
I think so. I was just trying to get all the main points that I want to. But there's obviously stuff in between, but it's the main points that I want to really get across. See how it goes. I mean, this is the first time I'm doing it in front of like techie people.
Totally.
Yeah.
So
I take it you've dictated it to your girlfriend. Then.
yeah, she was like, yeah. She still could pick holes in it, and she's like, yeah,
That's all right.
this I didn't understand any of this, and you didn't really give any good examples here after seeing this thing. I was like,
It's
oh,
probably
okay.
better because you won't fill in the blanks.
Yeah.
Kind of
Totally.
Yeah.
I'm not really. I've got a little bit of an example of how you can deal with legacy systems. I'm not really sure if it's a good thing to put in a talk, but I'm going to put it in anyway so I can get feedback.
I remember that guy. I can't remember his name now. He is part of the PHP voting group or something. I can't remember his name, but
Paul M. Jones.
I think that might be him. He's the one that does the framework that's designed for kind of legacy systems. Again, can't remember what it's called, but it kind of like draws in components of other frameworks so you can piece by piece replace.
Might not be him then.
No, I think it is Paul though.
There's Paul Dragunis, who's Scottish.
That's it.
He's a Scottish guy, and he actually helps out
that
with
is him.
Scotland PHP.
Yeah, because he did a talk here. He was based down in Newcastle for a while as well.
I think he knows a lot.
Yeah, he knows a lot about PHP.
Yeah.
I think he's been working in for God knows how long now. So. I didn't even bother. I never really used PHP until I left uni.
Same.
I didn't use PHP until I started my last job. Like I used PHP many years ago to learn how to program.
I never even.
I was firmly 2 feet in JVM, and then I started my next job. I was like, okay, I've just picked this straight back up. It's not really changed much other than isn't it Java like.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Start with C.
Bugger.
C++ and C. Visual Basic as well.
I've only done a
Got
tiny
really
bit
good
of C.
view. This is not funny. Got a really nice view from the window.
When they pay a lot for it.
Oh, you got that.
Yeah.
I think if we're moving to Sky Park 5, you do actually overlook the river.
Nice.
Yeah.
Which one's Sky Park 5?
The one, as you're walking down to the river, it's that building there.
That's the one that I went to originally when I came for my interview.
I think Stephen did that as well when you go.
Oh, the Google Maps sends you the wrong way, basically.
Yeah. It does.
And I came down the river because it was early, so I was like, oh, I'm going down the river.
Sat in the park for half an hour. Oh, that's my flat. You can see the dome of the.
Oh yeah. So I must
Sea
just be
temple.
just
Just to the right.
just the right, maybe like Orange Tower.
Oh yeah, because that'll be the. No, you can't see the Sky Park unless it's that grey bit.
See the building that looks like holy cheese next to the rotunda.
Yeah.
It's behind that.
Yeah.
Actually, no, you can see it from here. It's on the right hand side.
Oh, yeah. Just about. That's Sky Park 5. Yeah.
Yep.
You get a decent view of the dome. What do they call that thing again?
Where do they come in?
Why or where?
When?
When? I have no idea.
I was thinking whether I'll be here or not.
Probably the start of next year.
Then no. Then it's
When you're shifting.
around February, but I'm not going to commit to anything. So I don't turn up one day and say, alright, bye.
Fine, yes, that'll be fine.
I like how the cloud port has a really shiny sign and it's just a big rusty crane.
I've already had it approved by Alan, so that's fine. People know how to use Slack these days. And they're just throwing stones into the...
There's throwing STV stones.
STV
It's gonna have security coming out and
I charge them 50p or something. Don't know, is that mirrored glass or something? Can they actually... It must be mirrored.
yeah. I hope so.
Or just stare at them, just like...
Perfect. I'm looking forward to having a piece in the downstairs from my desk.
Jesus. You have to work to eat a piece.
That we shall be shouted for.
Oh, right. So, weekend.
Weekend. Saturday, I think. But not Sunday. Saturday.
Not that it's any different now, because you could just go across the road. To be honest, I've not been that much, even though it's right next to us.
The thing is, it's so disappointing compared to what Leith have that I can't
Oh yeah, Leith had a lot
make
more
myself
food.
pay that much money for that little of a sensible.
Yeah, Leith had
Awesome.
There's the Great Western Sandwich.
Oh yeah, there's loads of people already here.
Yep.
Which is good.
Oh, that's the app. It seems to be good.
Presumably just leave them downstairs.
What we got?
Oh, 2 years to go. It's the curious thing. You know what I forgot? All of them, yes. That's all right. Thanks.
That's what I'm definitely not doing. I'm not touching sugar.
I saw somebody in Edinburgh who was pretty sloshed.
Yeah.
At his talk.
Uh-huh.
It was a tech meet up over there, and yeah, he was. That was quite funny. Just stumbling over himself. Can't do any worse than that.
Dig in, whatever. I think the two at the side are gluten-free ones, the rest are normal.
Is tech meet up still running, Glasgow?
I think it's just split off into many different meetups.
Yeah.
That's what I've been told anyway.
Because the Edinburgh one was huge. Tech meet up. Just never really runs in Glasgow, does it?
No, they stopped doing it in Glasgow because they couldn't find the speakers to start off with, and then they went down to every 2 months or every 3 months they started doing it, and no one started turning up because no one knew when it was.
Yeah,
That's why you're better off just having a meetup and not necessarily having a talk.
I think because they changed the date every time they did it as well.
Yeah. I think if there wasn't going to be a talk, I'd be better off just having some sort of like sit-down, lean coffee style.
I'll say Python Glasgow and all that. They have like a pub night 1 month and then talks the next.
I think that's good, just because it switches it up a bit. You don't necessarily just go there to chat.
Lean out to Edinburgh was quite good for that.
I see that's eventually, after playing about with those sorts of things, like I didn't have it only has HDMI cables. And
I have a converter if you want.
never mind, it doesn't matter. We've got it set up
They're
now.
sorted now.
Yeah. But yeah, I've got it streaming on YouTube as well, so the guy down in Newcastle can watch it. So hopefully the sound quality is good. Also, it's good for me as well because I get to hear back and see what I've done with it. Yeah, very good. See if I can improve.
This is my first talk, so I've never done like any sort of presentation before, so I'm excited to see how it goes.
Yeah, I've put it up on Slack page.
Yeah, I'll do that now. Yeah.
Yes, me too. I was too short.
Sadly, it's got my my old YouTube handle,
Too short
so
and
it's,
too long.
gets
Too
rolled.
long.
So eventually, that'll be changed. Might be an idea if we could get like a, official like PHP sort of channel, that sort of thing. It's quite easy to stream
Okay.
with YouTube anyway.
So much fancies addressing.
But then again, it might also be a bit too much effort depending on certain venues.
Yeah, I don't know. Streaming it. But I could always bring my camera and point that quite easily. And put it up later. Like, I don't think there's anything that urgent for people to see, streaming wise.
No.
If it was up the next day or something, I'm sure that would be fine.
Yeah, definitely.
Have you used it?
You got more than one viewer, mate.
A guy that hosts Tech Me hosted in Edinburgh was wanting, he'd done it in Edinburgh for organisers there. And he was just wanting organisers to talk to each other a bit more. And,
Okay, I see.
share ideas.
I've got my PR team on the job. Mike, just Glasgow PHP, is that okay?
I bumped into them.
Sorry?
If I just Glasgow PHP, is that alright?
Or the bass player. I just
I think you sent your message on Slack about it.
It's like, this was dinner with this rock guy, and he's like, yeah, because I think they what do you call it, like back into something Las Vegas.
Notifications.
So they were quite,
Yeah.
Quite nice.
the guy was, no, you wouldn't have thought. He was,
It was like ad jam and then like the ad tech.
he was wasn't very good. It's like,
There's been no hackathons.
One from Skyscanner. Yeah.
Go right.
I can't remember people's names.
Yeah, that's
Are you
basically
good indeed? I don't know why I haven't got the notification.
over by Home Group.
That's what's on. Okay, Christmas dinner.
But yeah, no, she said she just wanted to do
Old plantation house, but the guy converted barns and stuff was the rental.
No, they're over in.
I think
it must be the same people.
there's a few suggestions
They're
in
in
that about kind of
And then the guy
being able to share resources and space.
Okay, shit. Everyone should organise
Send,
something for
like,
Skyscanner. That's
help,
the thing.
well, help
We'll work on something.
suggest speakers, so if someone else was interested. So if you did well today and you wanted to do a talk somewhere else, put you in touch with people at
No, okay.
one of the local talks.
That's probably a good idea, yeah. Because sometimes you're not really sure. Like, I know I couldn't be given a talk here, but I don't know anywhere else that I'd welcome another talk, like a technical talk.
Especially because yours, I don't know, from the title anyway, yours isn't PHP specific.
No, the only
So-
thing that's PHP specific is the examples.
So yeah, I'm sure they would be quite happy.
It's pretty like it's the same. If you've got a legacy system,
exactly.
most likely going to test it very similarly. Especially if it's a web app. If it's a web app, then it's going to be really similar testing in most web applications, no matter what language.
Who went through the markup, through the markup office first time?
Wasn't me.
How was the talk last month? I didn't get a chance to come. What was it about? You were saying challenging your ideas of
Basically, yeah,
testing and how
that's what I was going to do.
100% coverage should be a minimum. Is that right?
Yeah.
Keep
I haven't seen any mention of it.
No, it's a part-time.
So I don't know. So I'll ask him.
And I really thought it was an interesting topic. It's a bit gutted I couldn't make it because it's like it's quite an extreme compared to what some other people suggest. And 100% coverage isn't something you should be trying to strive for. It's just like a maximum.
No, it's not it, but up from 100% coverage and that just like
found your pipeline.
another thing is you're not supposed to write tests for coverage. You're
Mhm.
supposed to write tests
Yeah,
to
you
cover scenarios.
Some
Yeah.
Java.
Okay.
So, as long as you're covering your
If I
scenarios,
did math, which I would have been DevOps now.
you should be covering 100%
I was
because
thinking about
you're
it.
covering
Mm-hmm.
those scenarios.
So as long as you've got all the different scenarios for a
Yeah.
particular feature, all the
Well, that's
possible
what I
outcomes.
took away from it, from the articles and stuff that I've read.
That's probably where I'm going to end up at all.
It's easy to tell people.
Anyone been working on anything exciting in their spare time?
Most boring
What
thing
is-
is
what is spare time?
I don't know. I was just hoping someone else would because I know how it happened.
Spare time. What is that? I've been doing Amazon stuff actually. It's really interesting. I set up a serverless Amazon API using
Oh, really?
Lambda and API gateway and Amazon Cognito as well. Yeah, Lambda. Seems like there's so much you can do with Lambda.
What there's a guy from the BBC did a talk about AWS and Lambda. I think it was the DevOps meetup about how they use it for all of their.
Use it for knowledge and learning and stuff.
It was like a content catalog or something. I don't know what he was talking about. That looked pretty cool. But it saves a lot of money though because you're just paying for runs.
Yeah, a couple of.
What were you using it for specifically? If
I'm
you
just doing a Udemy course, so it's like it was setting up a serverless website where you can put in your age and your height and compare yourself to other people.
Because we're looking at serverless now, but
yeah, that's why I'm really interested. You
we
were saying
can't go
about it.
cloud really because of the company. So IBM have one called OpenWhisk, which you deploy and it's the same sort of thing as Lambda. You create functions, you register them, and you have them triggered by various actions.
Yeah.
So it's quite nice. I do like serverless. You don't have to care as much
Yeah.
about the boilerplate stuff.
I've been doing it with JS, which is horrible. I hate Node.js.
Yeah, but it only supports a certain set.
You can use PHP.
use PHP.
Okay.
You just wrap it in Node.js. That's the official guidance for PHP and Go and other languages that are supported.
That's the one thing about OpenWhisk. If you use it in their Bluemix platform as well, you just spin up a Docker container. So
Right.
any container.
I'm surprised they haven't switched over to using some sort of container format for Lambda.
I always thought they would at some point. Well, you know what Elastic Container thing is like.
ECS, yeah. We don't.
Is that another Amazon thing?
It's their Docker container.
It's meant to be like managed, but it's managed in the sort of unmanaged sense of the word.
Yeah, I tried to run it once and decided to drop the idea.
We had Amazon come in here a couple of weeks ago for Alexa workshop type thing. And yeah, they were very much, if you're building an Alexa app, you need to use a Lambda. And I was advising to use Node.js or Python to do it. Right, okay.
Is Python supported directly? No.
Yeah.
Okay. Assholes.
Yes. I don't think it's the latest version of Python, but it's
No.
a version.
Yeah, so basically you package PHP binner and your files and you just aggregate that with Node.js.
Amazing.
You know, depends if you want to rewrite everything to Node or if you have existing code that you just want to run in. That's a very short, straight way of doing it.
Can't be that hard for to have PHP. That was the thing with OpenWhisk as it started to build itself. It was like, oh, PHP 7.1. Just built it for us. That's nice. I was expecting PHP 5.6 or something. Something like that. I do like Google Cloud stuff. GKE is quite nice.
The Amazon stuff is good, but the more I use it, the more I feel like I'm like stuck into it. Like there's no
Yeah.
way
You're tied into their services. their ecosystem.
Yeah. Get you while you're small and then you're stuck in it and you have to pay a lot of money.
Yeah. And it seems like you could easily lose track of all the different things to set up rules and policies and all this kind of thing. It seems like you quite easily lose track of everything that you've set up just to make your own application.
IAM stuff.
Yeah.
This is the Amazon. This is the Amazon business.
You need someone to look at the bill and
Yeah.
make sure.
Working at
Impossible.
a company last year, and when I joined, they were like, "Oh, our builds are very high on the line." Previous devs set up the entire infrastructure to duplicate in US, and they didn't know about it. But it was running there; it wasn't actually getting called or used by the mobile apps or anything. Just set up a separate one. And they probably forgot to connect it.
I've heard of another company where their CRM, they could press one button and it would spin up a full version of their stack for a dev environment, but then it wouldn't keep track of the fact that it was created. So they ended up with four of them essentially, just sitting there, not charged the entire month.
That's actually cool though.
Yeah, my mate was the one responsible for making that button, so he wasn't too chuffed.
Maybe not.
Yeah, he wasn't too pleased.
Alright.
Hi.
Hey guys, how's it going? Thank you for the conversation.
No, we were talking about how you I was spending money for your company. Just click a button. Amazon. Click. Deploy. Money. Click. Deploy. Money.
Well, what did I work out? That new AMD petaflop server thing that they've got.
It was the same price per hour on Amazon than it would be to just buy the hardware.
$500,000 an hour on Amazon to actually run that sort of thing with their GPU instances. Just like, see how much it costs. Like, you know, after 3 hours, you probably could have just bought the server. It's ridiculous. Yeah, we don't really do any AWS apart from the fact that we have a fixed line into them for everybody else to do AWS.
Yeah, an S3 pretty much.
Oh yeah, Ian did this. Their fixed line costs are expensive as well. You just want to hook up to their data center, it's 10, 20,000 a month, I think it is.
Crap.
Which is quite a lot.
That's nuts.
And they charge you more by the bandwidth. I think 10 gigabit was pushing 6 figures. Something like that. Zero and Google, half the price of it.
Yeah, Google Cloud's trying to be quite competitive at the moment, I think, because they're quite far behind.
Yeah, we don't see anyone using Google Cloud with us. It's all Amazon Web Services.
Yeah.
I think you got like 300 pounds now if you sign up to Google Cloud.
It's pretty good. I think we were sent a Chromebook for
Just-
trying out Google Cloud. Just like, here, have a Chromebook. We'll have a webinar.
No, it's even better. Chromebook was there to start a Hangouts conversation with a salesperson.
Oh yeah.
It's literally what it was. You would open it up and it would start a Hangouts conversation with a cloud sales engineer or whatever. And
I think they
just
sent
keep
the
Chromebook.
I think they sent the case first, and they were like, hey, if you want to do a webinar, we'll give you something to fill this.
That was it. Yeah, they sent the case in.
It's like sending your Valentine's Day card with like a pay-as-you-go thing.
Kind of. But yeah, they were really interested in doing things.
Yeah,
It's
they're
all
really
the,
pushy.
the Internet of Things stuff that they're doing now. So AWS has the IoT stuff, Google has IoT Core, IBM has Watson IoT. So they're all just clamoring for people to actually use it instead of just sitting around doing nothing. So, yeah. That's one thing I've been working on in my spare time, as soon as you were asking.
Yeah.
Terraform for the IoT platforms.
Alright, okay.
So HashiCorp's Terraform does, it's a manifest style system for sitting on top of multiple cloud providers.
So you can easily deploy to.
AWS is your OpenStack, the rest of them.
That's cool.
But they don't do it for the IoT stuff, which it all has different sort of API commands.
Mhm.
I was looking at that. I was getting signed off on how and I don't want to release it. It's too close to what we do at work.
It's interesting though, being able to do that. That'd be quite cool if you were able to deploy easily to different IoT cloud platforms.
It's all about vendor lock-in with them, so HashiCorp.
Yeah, kind of like it stops that. You go, oh, these guys are costing us lots. Switch. It was really as simple as turn off AWS, turn on Google Cloud, and
That's why we're looking at it as well, because Terraform will manage vSphere VMs, but then they also migrated to AWS with a similar structure if you need it. So you can go to the cloud. Right, click.
That'd be mad.
Toilet. Is there a toilet on this floor, Nick?
Yeah. So if you go straight out the door, it's like straight ahead, but as you come to the door on the right.
Okay, cool.
I'm getting old because I can't stand up without making a noise.
I need to see how bolts progress since the last used it. I don't use it in about a year.
I haven't heard anything about it.
Alright.
I want to start using this.
Yeah, I need to rewrite that. Yeah.
Vault Keeper.
Yes.
Just make it open source.
So they might have added that functionality in the last time I used it, I'm not sure.
They might have, yeah. Like end-based.
Yeah.
I've not heard of a Vault client.
The thing that frustrated me a lot with it when I was using it was essentially unusable versions, so you couldn't edit a key, you had to read the key, modify the key, replace the key, so it was replace only.
So it's posting, but no put.
Yeah.
That kind of makes sense from a security standpoint. Because Vault can back onto a HSI, I think.
Probably. I remember it being really frustrating because you could set up a kind of like an environment or whatever, and you have to read the environment, modify the single key value pair, and then push it, push the entire environment back onto it. So it wasn't. It'd be fine if it was just like a key level, but since it was at an environment level,
That would get pretty frustrating.
so I had some bash scripts for. I think I've somewhere. I've got some bash scripts for sorting that out.
Yeah, I can actually see that being quite
Where it
frustrating.
would read it out, parse it to JSON, you would edit it, and put it back from JSON to alt commands. Yes. It was. I had the conversion was
I've used like JSON. That just sounds horrific though. I've never heard of a Vault client though, so I don't think they've done it yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I went for some trigger.
Yeah, I'm trying to avoid that.
Yeah.
It's one of those
Yeah.
LEDs behind the
Yeah. I think it's blue one.
something went very, very green. What's behind the curtain?
Just chairs, mate.
Oh, that's right. I didn't realise there was a behind.
Which of the many switches will turn on the lights?
That's like the ones at our office, like half of them actually do the lights, the other half don't.
Do you mind just doing it with Alexa? No, sure.
Well, I've already built a news system.
It's one thing I've always wanted to try.
Or you can get a free pair of socks and an Echo Dot if you submit a skill the first 1,000 pieces. You submit a skill and that's all.
What's that? Sorry,
Did you get yours?
I was
Yes, yeah, I
way
managed to get it fixed.
Cool.
for Alexa. So if you make a skill
I can't remember what
and you
was wrong
publish
with
it,
it. I kind of started from scratch again.
they'll give you a free pair of socks and an Echo Dot.
Did you not see that murder case with the
Yeah,
Alexa?
I heard about that one. They actually
That's nice.
they had to ask Amazon for.
They actually had recordings. That's why I don't trust them. Like, wait a minute, where are those recordings? They're on Amazon.
They could, you could literally say anything, even if it's a joke, and then all of a sudden it's a case about you, and you just said it as a joke.
Yeah,
This
that's
thing
why
is
it's
taken out of context.
It's
like,
until the
Google's one was
what were you saying about fields of wheat?
I see Google did the Raspberry Pi labs.
I really didn't get one of those.
Yeah, I might buy one anyway when they come out.
I think they're available still.
Because they're localized, they don't need to.
So that rather than find bed in that.
No. So
That's what I thought.
there is my favorite IoT hat ever, which was the Nyan hat.
So just a
Yeah, it's went around in a circle in your hat. Anyway.
Did it play the song as well?
Yeah, no.
Right, we need to start now. Yeah, Pete's Christmas beer.
Yes.
We'll just keep doing that. Just keep
Can we make it an Alexa skill? So we'll carry an Echo Dot on it. So, hey Alexa, turn on the beer.
Turn on the beer.
It's got a Wi-Fi board with a battery.
So you
Or we can have it controlled over the street.
Wait a minute.
I'm joking, I've got
Imagine next
Turn the beard on.
No, I can have it controlled by text message.
No, come on. We've got to go one step further. Have an app.
I have everything. Text message, voice call.
We'll get messages saying text this number for one time.
It just makes us feel like
What's the usage like on this?
Actually,
we get
set them up on those like message belt buckles and put the messages on it. The number.
Well, actually, I've got really lightweight, small OLED screens, so you can actually take measure them.
they only recently
Get some glasses with LED, an LED screen door thing.
So
You can text messages into it. That could get really
I
difficult.
kind of do want to.
Yeah.
Just don't keep me.
Come on, Ed,
We'll
yeah.
have like an approved one.
Feel free. There's loads of food coming through. Whatever.
You know, the logo. Chris. I think they're getting rid of that. Oh, that needs to go on the website somewhere.
Did you see that slide though?
So they only launched that
Facial
about
expression.
a month or something.
They made a
Or just before the championship.
They made a presentation.
I thought there was only going to be
a child's test.
58 posts.
You know the video.
And most of it are probably people in the building.
Same people who did that.
But no, that's more than that.
We have a YouTube channel.
Yeah, I mean, like 20 subscribers.
Fancy.
Because yeah, we kind of
like 10 of them
launched it, we didn't really hear about it.
10 of them are probably Nigel's fan.
It has a
Saying that we had built
It has a
platforms.
PS1 style like music bed.
So I didn't expect many people.
Yeah, it was kind of like.
They've not advertised
Every
it.
time I talk-
But,
Every time she talks
it's making many money. So
He just wants to snap somebody over. That's not-
Wasn't the
Probably what took out with you when you went to the.
Yeah.
featured in
yeah,
their
wasn't the Billy's doing
scale
the
competition things like that. Right, yeah, good.
So we're getting the proper option.
So this is Mike, the other organizer.
Just come to me.
Yeah, no, it's good chat.
Thursday last week. Oh, okay, I see.
See, like,
Yeah, yeah, it's
there's no downside to this.
Yeah.
Plus, you're not going to have as much money.
Can't buy drugs.
You're not going to have money. You're not going to have.
Thing is with London though, even if you were to get like a 10 grand London truly cost living in.
Neil's brother only now feels like he's comfortable living in London and he makes 90 grand a year. My mate works there for Bloomberg. Still.
He's like the opposite.
So it's October.
Yeah.
For
Software developer.
For people like me, that's like quite high.
General software.
Yeah, so it's
They probably, well, actually, since they're all of them, they'll probably look for colours.
the back actually is terrible. The middle one's the brightest.
It's like specifics like, oh, you won't care about this feature.
You sell all for tech. You've got
You won't need to know Virgin. Things like that.
testing.
Why do you need to? Really, what is enough?
We've got two virtual media ones as well.
Yes, the old one.
That makes a lot more sense.
There's the now TV box there, the white one.
Yeah.
That's tiny, it's a very Roku, isn't it?
Yes.
And the beer is an Apple TV.
Oh, yeah, you can actually jailbreak the...
Me and the Apple TV.
Do you have a keyboard for yours though? Or do you have
I've got the Swixy mouse.
I mean,
it's like the mouse project.
My problem with the Apple TV is the clicky bit. If you have the clicky mouse, you have to manually type
Right.
in.
See the new one, right? It's got Siri buttons.
So that real
So it's like, so if I'm looking
That's for problem
TV or whatever, not the Apple TV.
You're looking for
If I'm looking up
they want it launched.
just more than like no countdown. There we go. If I'm looking for countdown, I can press the button. It will search the
I don't like countdown, but I love when Jimmy Carter's in.
Oh yeah.
Trying to separate that's clear
I
and
rewatched the bit where they were all talking about
Oh,
so good. So good.
It's even better because it's corner. She's on the 10 Cats one.
You've not seen a YouTube series about the orange
Is it good?
this is just
It's funny.
it's supposed to be an example of all the devices that you can get FTV
That's quite
but no one knows what to use it. It's organised by a third-party company and no one gave anyone any training. So I think there's some of the guys in our IT department know what it is. We're not going to set them all up. But most of the
See, for me, I'd like to get
I went to TV broadcast systems.
In the morning.
They did like giant sort of networks.
I have no experience. I still did that.
It's just like giant sort of place and waste
I suppose that often happens for me. It's like,
yes, things like scenes
oh,
or the first like 10 minutes. It's like,
oh yeah, by the way, this is wrong.
That's good. I'm back at the panel for just pages. I found like 2 minutes of jam. Last 2 things. They just fall down.
they're all alongside as well. And the back.
Nice place to work. I've been to years ago.
We're busy, so if you're really good at feedback for next time.
there's the dinners at the side.
What should we do? How should we change it?
I like getting feedback up front so I don't have to do it this way.
Yeah, I agree. I hate building the wrong thing. It disheartens me when I go, I've spent all this time building something that it wasn't really what was meant to be built.
I guess with design it's a little bit, it can be a little bit quicker, but it's not
We've got Karina and Stephen, obviously.
Yeah.
Karina's already functional problem.
She's on my own. Focused on supplying the hardware and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, Chris was saying that she made a whole presentation for Nigel, and it was about like, oh, Glasgow is can be this interconnected city, and it was really all about the hardware, and then I was like, we don't sell, we don't manage the hardware at all. Because of that, yeah. Like it wasn't what.
We're lucky because people are like right now.
That's it. That's why she's also.
Oh, they got
Can't do that either. Sorry.
She's enthusiastic though. I
That
like
was really frustrating because we have inner documentation and we do it.
He pays for it, so it's easier for them to find somewhere to just
It's just like when you get a server, you download the you get him there
It's a good thing for directors saying.
But when it comes to spamming, quite a lot of them.
Dale's what it is, well, he starts behind you, he does procurement stuff. He said that to me.
Have you spoken to him?
I've spoken to him once on the first day, and he said hello, and I said, and then I was like, oh, so what are you in for? Assuming that he's going to be part of Scott and Simon's team, because they were just they were ignoring Scott and Simon. And I was like,
this is
that's what they're looking for.
No, he's great.
Yeah, but he does procurement. I was like, I don't know. He said, I was like, awesome. I have no idea what that is. And I was
He's buying things.
Yeah, he's the one that bought the 2 new laptops.
Yeah,
really? Okay.
Wow,
That's
yeah, he sent it. Most of it's like supplier sites or SIM cards.
Oh, is he not?
No, just in orders to and he's throughout the round.
You're going to be doing exactly the same thing.
So he's the person who can meet with friends if on night
because everyone on holiday.
No, if you want nice things, you're dead quick.
Yeah.
To be honest, great. Just no beer.
Great, I'm getting a bottle of wine. Okay, you want it.
I bet he loves it.
He likes whiskey. I like to
Right. And one day, we're going to take you to that intersection.
Yeah,
It's just a wall.
We don't have a ticket list of people, like, so it's just whoever turns up.
They do beer as well there. I bought a 3-pack of beers and it came with a free tour of the distillery. And I was like, how much then? I was like, "Oh, give me a free tour."
I don't drink beer anymore. Just they make it so
Yeah, you just
it's always tricky with the rubbish stuff. You identify it as beer and not just the other
So I don't know if you try to do something to automatically pull back your attention. Join. No, that only works with recently. Well, that was a startup. This kind of panel thing is down here. Oh, why try that? Yeah, well,
I thought you were going to have fuel.
No, I was like, oh, maybe I'll have fuel. And I was like, you know what, pizza. I didn't have fuel.
Until any of those services.
Normally when I have pizza, I make it myself.
well, it's
I love doing that. Sometimes I don't want to make dough, so you get wrapped and you can just put
But you still have to sign up when
stick me up on a piece of
Oh,
stuff.
yeah. It's more of it's
Alright, okay.
Scare of space.
The risk is way high.
Well, yeah. You're if you survive the risk, you're in space. Get to see the planet. That's huge.
That's why I find it
or going to the moon and actually seeing space land.
For like a B movie, hey, we're great. I want to go to the moon to get there.
Footprints are still there, but the flag is just a huge point. But they've taken a short cut of the landing site. I was waiting to see because you see the rover as well, white cars.
Yeah, it'll be an all three.
Marcus pointed out that you put 3 different screens, they're all...
I know they're different colours as well.
Yeah.
Different brightnesses. Is it for testing? Just focus on one. No, we've got loads of other devices through in the office space for testing these are just for meetings and presentations.
We thought it was for testing because you got each one's labelled for what type of box it is.
No, it was a third-party company that actually built the unit and put all the boxes in, and we pay them a monthly fee to kind of manage it. But no one actually knows how to use it.
How about we build you a cabinet, put the boxes and set them all up for you, and we will
I
manage.
don't think anyone actually. There's some people in IT that know how to use it, and you can't phone them to ask.
But what would you actually get? It's like one skybox have different skybox.
Well, it's supposed to be each of these devices is something that you can get a player on, or
Oh, right, so it's the actual player app, so you can test the app.
well, this isn't for testing, but yeah, it's just for presentations now.
I suppose if you are demoing something, you will need a specific device to demo it on.
It's for TV as well as internet things. So people get it on Virgin and you can get it on don't actually have apps on these, but you can still get the TV channels and whatever else. So that was what it was to showcase. But yeah,
It's like serious. I want to have it in the BBC building next door.
yeah, they're building it near the news. Obviously has a lot more money.
You've got taxpayer funding.
But no, for our department, we've got all of our test devices.
Oh, no, I mean,
Test devices. So there's 20 screens through there or something like that. All on different walls and people's desks and whatever else. You get a lot of the same shows because testers transport them in certain ways and then we use the same platforms. So
That's one way you can turn someone into a
It's like a good program, not something
usually like Jeremy Kyle or Coronation Street or something like that.
They go home and they go, how many tests? It's a brilliant, it's just cut out
But no, we've got lots of other things like big device drawer full of phones and tablets.
They found all these streams of random videos attached to it. They came out loads of these ones, like all these different. Right? Well, it's all the conspiracy theories. It was like communicating some random way. It's after a bit, it was just like Google, like, so that's just lost testing on service. Oh, right. Yeah.
It's also, I thought it was like the pepper stations in because they like to unlock or somebody walks straight into the office and stole everybody walks in the room. So now it's like a cage apparently.
That's one way to stop it.
Sorry, the Domino's budget's gone.
Yeah, today we're having the PHP meetup in Wetherspoon. Every other venue gets I wouldn't mind in Wetherspoon with cheap drinks and good afternoon. I love the old style pubs. I know, I'm having it in other venues. But I was saying if that was ever last number one thing, choice.
I was at a hack for ages ago, and I had like an old sort of ThinkPad thing at the time, and I was shouting this massive thing, like, shit, I've left my iBook on the table, you know, and sort of going, then stolen stuff. It's like, I'm fine, I've got the only crappy PC on the table full of packs. No one's still like that.
Plus, it's probably going to be heavier as well, so there's more weight to carry. I'm not going to take that, it's going to weigh me down. I can have three.
That's what I like about the second hand is a T60. It's just like, oh fuck, it's only 50 quid. Pretty much, but I can do that anyway. That's solid. Well, no, I did. I had a waterproof bag with the ThinkPad and a 2-litre bottle of Pepsi leaked into the bag because it was waterproof. None of it leaked out. So it just sat in that Pepsi for about an hour. And still had
It's true, you can just do that crazy.
Pepsi dried into the back like but it still ran, and whenever it got hot, it basically smelled faintly of Pepsi.
I've been had last 20 years. I only stopped using it recently. Just because I wanted, we were using this TDD player, and I wanted something more resolution. But it was still going. The space bar was broken, the down key was broken, so I could only boot into a top operating system. It still worked. Pretty impressive.
Maybe just a bit to start.
Yeah.
Let's get going. Cool.
I'll get the slides up. Turn the other two TVs on because they're falling asleep.
Yeah.
It's not the situation the one day before we felt bad about it. Sorry, we should have lost it.
Balance out the
That's a great.
Hi guys, welcome to Glasgow PHP. There's many more, no, much more of you than I expected. So, good. Thank you for coming. Today we have Tom, who will be talking about working with legacy applications. But before that, I would like to thank STV, Markup Digital, JetBrains, and who else? Oh, if I forgot, I'm sorry. Any other sponsors that we have. And, well, I don't know. We are looking for speakers for next 2 months. So if you have something you want to talk about, feel free to prepare a short talk. It doesn't have to be a full hour talk. It can be just 50 minutes, whatever. Share whatever projects you're working on, if you're working on something cool or not. Well, others will decide, I guess. So, Tom, welcome.
Cheers, thank you. Okay, hi there, my name is Tom. Thanks for coming tonight. Really appreciate you all coming down, spending your evenings coming to listen to me talk. I'm really excited to give this talk today. I've been coming to this PHP meetup for about a couple of months now, and I really enjoy coming here and learning from other people, and I feel like it's really helped me in my day-to-day job. So today I was thinking a couple of months ago when I was listening to one of the talks what I could maybe do to share my experience and what a talk I could give to share my experience with people that attend this meetup. And so what I came up with was working with legacy applications using TDD. So something that I do
regularly, and hope you enjoy it. So, the main topics that I'm going to be talking about today are what is a legacy system? Why do we work with legacy systems? Why do we work on legacy systems? How do we work with these legacy systems, and how do we test them? I'm going to give you an example as well of how to work with a legacy system. So here's some of the jargon that I'm going to be using throughout my talk. So characterization tests, describing the actual behavior of an existing piece of software. Unit tests. A unit test provides a strict written contract for a piece of code it must satisfy. Functional or business requirements. So they're just the functions of a system or component. And regressions. So software regressions are the deterioration in software, meaning one or more functions that might have been working previously no longer work. So what is a legacy system? So this is Wikipedia's definition. I like to think that a legacy system is something that provides value. Might be quite old, might be using not so modern technology. Some attributes of a legacy system might be that it just might not be very well maintained, might not be regularly worked on. It could be that the system itself doesn't have any tests or any automated tests. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't provide value. So the legacy system still could form a much needed business use case. It might solve a very important problem too. So some examples of legacy systems could be one related to PHP would be maybe an old WordPress site. Might not be necessarily be the most fancy software, it's just a blogging platform, but you could have a situation where you're having to maintain a legacy WordPress site. Another example could be Drupal. There's a lot of Drupal applications, especially some of the older ones that are maybe using Drupal 6 or maybe even earlier than that, and they're also could be good examples of a legacy system. Moving away from PHP, you have any COBOL applications written in COBOL. There is a shortage of COBOL developers, like I've sort of heard anyway, not that I've actually tried. But a lot of old banking software, insurance software, even medical software was written in COBOL, and that needs to be either improved or worked on, and again, provide value. So, legacy system is something that is still actively in use and provides value. So, why do we work with these legacy systems? Why don't we just chuck them out the window and replace them with something more modern? The problem is it's not always easy to do that. It's sometimes the legacy system could solve a very complex problem. It could be very intricate. It could have a very specific way of dealing with certain scenarios that might not be easily just to replace and write from scratch. Legacy systems provide value, as I've stated before, and they'll contain a lot of business knowledge. Like there'll be a lot of domain knowledge in these systems that you might lose if you decide to try and replace them. An example could be that if you have a shipping application, there might be
a very specific product that needs to be shipped in a very certain way, and that would be lost if you might try to completely replace it or rewrite that application, because it might be something that's defined in right down in the deeper levels of the legacy system's code base. And why we work on legacy systems as well is because they provide this value, because they contain all this knowledge, might not necessarily mean they're easy to work with, and that's why you might need to modernize it to make it a bit easier to understand, a bit easier to work with, bring in more modern features of whatever programming language that is used. So the reasons why we work with legacy systems are because they usually solve a complex problem, and it might not be so easy just to completely replace them. It might take time to replace them. So how can you work with and test legacy systems? So there's numerous different ways of dealing with a legacy system. One specific way is just to keep on working on it without actually trying to improve it. Just keep on bolting on features that come up, or maybe just quickly fixing the bug and not actually thinking about what's causing the bug. And this can be good if you understand the code base. You might be able to get away with it. You can make quick fixes. It might be quite minimal effort, but it might become hard to maintain if you keep on adding feature after feature without thinking about the overall structure of the application. It does require knowledge, so you can't just, for instance, if you were onboarding a developer or onboarding a business analyst, you might not just be able to quickly get them up to speed. It might take them a month, 2 months, 3 months, even like half a year before they fully understand how the system works. And this can lead to frustration if someone doesn't really fully understand what the system is doing. You could use the Boy Scout rule. This is quite a good way if you're working intermittently on the project, if you've only got like a couple of hours each week to actually go in and make a change, and you can make small changes that improve the code base over time. So an example of making a small change could be making a variable name, just changing a variable name so it's a bit more meaningful, maybe a whole class, or changing the name of a class, or if you wanted to you found a small component that you could maybe decouple from another. So say you've got like a database layer, you need to that's involved with some of the presentation layer. You might decide, okay, I'll try and extract that out, and so that it's not necessarily has direct contact to the database layer. And that could be a good way of using the Boy Scout rule, which is, leaving the campground better than how you found it. But this has cons as well. Like, it does take longer to implement. Like, you do have to spend a little bit more time in making any changes. It might not work for highly coupled code bases because you might not have you might need to sit down for, say, more than a couple of hours to actually think, okay, so how is this one component used? And if it's used in like multiple places, like, it will take you a long time to think, oh, how can I extract that component? And another reason is it's brittle. It's not. If you do make a small change, even the smallest thing like changing the name of a variable or changing the name of a function or a class, that could have knock-on consequences. And if you don't have a test suite to check that you're gonna break something. And rewriting. So this can be a good idea. I'm not saying it's always the right idea, but if it's for very small and self-contained components, it might be a good idea just to chuck everything out the window, start from scratch, and if you understand exactly what the component's doing, this could be a really good idea because you could straight off the bat use modern technologies. And having a rewrite does have its advantages. But if it's quite a complex, system, doing a complete rewrite might not be the way to go. You might potentially have feature regression, which is the idea that you originally had the ability to perform some functions that the end user will need, and then as you rewrite it, you might forget about adding back in those features, and that's then lost. Again, it takes time. Like you might think at the start, oh, I'm making great progress. I've already added all this new modern technology, but as over time, you might realize that the structure of your application isn't really suited to the legacy system that you are developing, and it just isn't a guarantee that what you're writing is going to be better than what the legacy system was. So you might have spent all that time rewriting it, and it might not be any better. In fact, it might be worse. So my preferred methodology, but again, not always the best solution, is refactoring using tests. So tests ensure correct functionality. So you're going to have to, if you understand the legacy system and its business requirements and functional requirements, you can write these characterization tests that encompass the whole of the system to make sure that any changes you make won't break the system or won't make anything regress. So this, if you do this correctly, it does lead to no feature loss. You retain the business knowledge that the old legacy system had, and it allows you to make changes with confidence instead of always in the back of your mind wondering, did I break something if I made that small naming change? If I extracted a component, did that break anything? But if you have the test there in the first place, it can give you a lot of confidence. There are cons. You have to really understand the system. You need to understand all the edge cases, all the different business requirements, and it's not something that. It does also take a lot of time as well. If it's a really key system that in the business you're working in, it can be a really good idea to use refactoring using tests, because it allows you to ensure you haven't broken anything. But it could require a lot of tests, which can be, depending on the scale and the size of an application, could be it might not be the best decision. For instance, if you have like a banking system, I imagine they have many different scenarios that they need to cover if they were to fully refactor. Therefore, they would have to write a whole suite of tests, and just writing this test suite alone take a couple of months, and that's before they even make a change. So there are downsides to this, but then again, I still feel that the confidence you get from being able to make these changes knowing you haven't broken something really is a big plus for this method. So how and where do we start testing? So how do we start going about refactoring a legacy application? So first things first, you need to build up your understanding of the code base. You need to understand what the system is trying to do. What problems is this system trying to solve? So to do that, most of the time you're going to need to create a production-like environment. You need to go and create something that's maybe not identical to production, because that's not necessarily, you might not necessarily be able to do that, but you need to be close to production so that you can actually have a play about with the system. If you're a developer, really get your hands into the system, understand what's it really doing under the hood. The other thing you need to do is you need to communicate with the people that are involved. You can be a really good developer, but if you aren't willing to or able to communicate effectively with the people that are using the system and the people that really rely on the system, then you're not gonna be able to make an effective refactor, because you really need to understand what the problems the system's trying to solve. You need to create a test suite. So, and creating a test suite, there's a couple of things you need to do for that. So you need to first off choose your tooling. You need to choose what are the best tools to use to test your system. For instance, a web application, you might use Selenium or Phantom.js or Chrome Headless for testing certain elements and items on a page and making sure when you have a certain user clicks a certain amount of buttons that you see a certain output. If you're testing some sort of a batch processing, you might not necessarily need Selenium to do that because you're not going to be interacting with the browser. So you might be very database or process oriented. So you might see, okay, given that I'm trying to process this item, what are the different outcomes that could happen if it goes to a state of processing, a state of queued or a failed state? What are the different outcomes for that? So that could be very database orientated. So for a batch processing and even for a website, you need to understand the different test data that you will need, because before each test you want to ensure that it's in the same state for every test. Because a problem that you could have down the line is if one test if you have a shopping cart application, if one test creates multiple items and adds items to that cart, and another test is relying on that cart to be empty, then you're going to have a problem where the second test will fail because it expects the cart items not to exist. So it's really important for each test that you're running that starts from the same slate. The other thing you need to actually ensure is your test data is flexible enough that you're allowed to test multiple scenarios, because you might have multiple requirements. So if I go back to the cart situation, you might have a customer that is based in the US and wants to buy things in US dollars. So, that'll be one case that you'll need that test data for. But there could be another scenario where there's another US customer, but they prefer to pay in pounds or in euros or in Bitcoin. So that's going to require another set of test data. And it's just these small things that you need to understand when you are writing these tests. So, writing the first test. So, it always depends what your first test could be. If your system already has some unit tests, it might be a good idea to keep working on those unit tests to ensure that they are correct and they are testing what they are meant to be. If you don't have any test and you're starting from scratch, I would normally recommend doing a characterization test, which is testing what the system actually does. So ensuring that when you make a change, it still does that thing. So if you start using these characterization tests and writing these characterization tests and covering as many parts of your system as possible, you will be able to eventually make changes confidently, knowing that if anything fails, that you've broken something. But if they all pass, then it's all good. You can keep on going. So here I'm now going to show you an example of a working with a legacy application. So I'm going to show you a shopping cart, and it's very simple, very basic, just for the scope of this talk. It's just going to be a simple index.php file that's hosted on an Nginx server. It's not the cleanest at the moment. I would consider, even as it's a small example, I would consider this legacy code. And I'm going to walk through how we could go about refactoring this. So, as you can see from the example, it's doing a raw well, not raw, but it's using the PDO MySQL library. It's just fetching some customer data. It's then also fetching the cart and then doing some tax calculation to see what tax should be applied and what currency it's going to be in. And down below, it's just displaying that information. So it's not the messiest legacy system. Though I'm sure there'll be plenty out there that's a lot harder to understand than this. But I think because the shopping cart is a good example because of everyone kind of understands what the domain of a shopping cart and how to work with that. So the first thing I would do is start creating a test suite. So here I'm using PHP's Codeception library, which allows you to run different types of tests within a project and manage the test data fairly easily. I'm creating a suite called Characterization Suite, and that is just the name that I'm given for these type of tests to show that these are characterization tests. So using a SQL database dump for my clean slate for my test data to ensure that each test is going to start from the same position and so that they don't rely on each other. Just creating a cart items table, a carts table, and a customers table. You'll look at this and think this is not very well structured. I agree. But I'll do it for this example. So first things first is creating the characterization tests. So here I'm using I think a Selenium WebDriver or one of the Codeception's browser drivers to allow us to check for certain items on a page. I'm using the test data, hard coding in the test data, mind, and in this example, I'm making sure that the cart is displaying in pounds and is calculating the total correctly. I'm doing the same thing for euros, making sure that when customer has their preferred currency to euros, that it displays the euro currency symbol. A more different example is making sure that if the item has VAT applied to it, making sure that it calculates that VAT and includes the VAT in the total cost as well. And if there is a discount applied, I'm making sure that if they've spent more than £100, that they get a 20% off discount. This is what it looks like. As you can see, I'm a back-end developer. But this is what we are essentially testing for. So if you look back previous here, you can see that I'm checking for certain elements on the page, certain prices, and ensuring that they exist on the page. And when I then eventually decide to run the tests, I'm getting everything's fine, everything's good. So I'm sure there's a couple of scenarios I've missed out there, but if you have a good understanding of your legacy system and your code base and the business requirements, you should have multiple of these. It might take you a while to cover everything, and you might have to make trade-offs between covering everything and covering the most important aspects. But I think it is necessary when you're trying to make a refactor, because at the end of the day, you don't want to release something to a production environment and then you get a phone call saying things are broken. That's quite stressful and it doesn't look good for the business. Whereas taking that extra bit of time thinking about the different scenarios and speaking to people about the different expectations of the users, you can really get a really good coverage of your legacy system so that you can start making changes. So, I didn't mention this earlier, but characterization tests are quite brittle. If you notice, if I take you back to how I've written this characterization test, if any of these elements change, or maybe we change the structure of anything on this page, if we decide to make a functional change, this is going to break, and that means that we're going to have to fix this on the page. Now, Codeception does have a way of mitigating this problem by using these things called page objects, but at the same time, it still means if you do make a change, a functional change, that will require you to change these characterization tests. And the way to kind of mitigate that is by not just having characterization tests. You will need characterization tests to start off with, but as you find and pick out things that you can extract, you can start writing unit tests or integration tests to fill in the gaps that characterization tests might not necessarily be able to see. So in this case here, I've realized that I'm going to need a cart. I'm getting a lot of I'm using a database query to get all these cart items. I know that throughout the application that I will need to be getting the items out of a cart. So I've created a simple repository class. And again here, before the start of the test, I'm loading in the data. But then I'm making sure that each test is going to be working from the same position by using the PDO's and MySQL's transaction library. Well, not library, but functionality. So each test is going to start from the same position. And here's just checking that when you try and find when trying to retrieve carts for a specific customer, you get specific cart items, and make sure you get the correct tax, the total cost without tax, and the total cost including tax. And then we've got another example of testing that particular unit. So this is my implementation of the cart repository. It's fairly straightforward. It might not be the cleanest way of doing it since I'm using PDO directly, but it'll do for this scenario. And I'm able to easily retrieve these cart objects that I've also created and some cart item objects that I've created. And what that allows me to do in the front end is it will allow me to just, instead of having to guess the database field names or remember the database field names, I can just use a good IDE like PHP Storm, and it will autocomplete them for me. So I've also got another unit test for calculating the tax as well. It's fairly straightforward. When you've got, you can't see this in the test, but the very last column is whether it is has VAT applied or tax applied. So here we'll see that that the socks and t-shirt have VAT applied, therefore they'll have, depending on this currency here, you'll get around £4.40 in tax. And here is the implementation. So you'll find that when you're writing or trying to extract certain code from the database, from your legacy system, you'll be able to just, you will find that certain pieces of information or certain functions are used in certain places, and that will allow you to, okay, I can extract that out for now, I can test this single component, so I'm not going to be completely relying on characterization tests down the line, slot it back in, and you've now got an extra component that's now tested, so it's fully unit tested, and you can then, this really promotes code reuse. So that's the rest of that example, fairly basic, and again, not production ready. If I was going to implement a cart, I'd probably use something like Magento 2 or Silius. Silius is an open source e-commerce framework, but so here's the new index.php class. So it's not perfect, no dependency injection in this class yet, but it extracts a lot of database queries outside of the the presentation layer. Stuttard is nice and easy IDE auto completion, and giving you an extra layer between your presentation layer and your database layer. And then when you run the tests, you now have some additional unit tests from what you've extracted, and you still got some passing characterization tests. And if you were to ever make them fail, or if you made a change that caused them to fail, hopefully you've written your tests in a way that makes them pass. So what I've just shown you here is that we've understood the business problem that we're trying to solve. We have written some tests that ensure that we're meeting business requirements, and then we're gradually making changes, trying to improve the code base, knowing that the tests allow us to be confident in making those changes because they prove that the system still meets those business requirements or the functional requirements. So yeah, I talked about what a legacy system is. It's a system that's still running day to day and provides value. Talked about how why we need to use legacy systems. And the reasons are because it might not be easy to replace these systems, and the systems themselves might solve quite complex problems. And we talked about how we can work with these legacy systems and test these legacy systems by, when you fully understand the problems these systems are trying to solve, you can then write tests to ensure that business requirements are, we can write business requirements based on our understanding of the legacy system's problems it's trying to solve, and going through an example of how to work with a legacy system. So hopefully today you're now going to be a bit more confident when you're working with legacy systems, knowing that the tests that you write prove that the application still works as intended. My name is Tom, thanks for listening. Can I have any questions? Picture. Just thought. No pictures in the entire talk except this one, and I thought, change of scenery, it's not Scotland, so I'm wearing a farmer's hat.
Should we give you a round of applause before or after questions?
You can choose to give me no round of applause or after the questions. Yeah, go ahead.
What makes the difference between a characterization test and a regression test?
They're probably the same word for the same type of test. Because a regression test is making sure that nothing regresses or making sure that nothing loses functionality. And a characterization test is the exact same thing. It's making sure that when you do make a change, you're not breaking old or existing functionality. And I'm quite sure that regression test is trying to ensure the exact same thing. Martin Fowler coined the term characterization test. So I know there's a couple of people in like PHP celebrities that really do try and get people to use the correct terminology. So I've been using characterization tests, but again, it could be called regression tests. It could be called characterization tests. I've heard people call it black box testing, which is like you have some input. You put it into the black box and you get some output. And every time you put in that same input, you get the same output. So that making sure that if you change, if you don't get the same output, you know that the black box is broken.
So is it less testing that the functionality is still correct? It's more just testing that it's the same as it was before.
Exactly.
The same was.
Mm-hmm. And that's the thing. The functionality might not be correct. It might be wrong. You might have a tax system that doesn't really calculate the tax correctly, but the characterization test won't tell you if it's calculated the tax correctly. It'll just tell you, yeah, it's calculating the tax the same way as it always has, which can be a good thing when you're refactoring. In fact, it is a really good thing when you're refactoring, because then you know that either the test is wrong or the functionality is wrong, or what you've changed is wrong. And if you look into that in a bit more detail, you'll be able to go, okay, the test is wrong and the functionality is wrong. Let's go change the test and change the functionality.
Yeah, you talked about, you know, it kind of seemed like you're replacing your characterization tests with unit tests, because you know, you're saying characterization tests are quite brittle. Presumably once you get a big suite of those and you start to replace the unit tests, do you advocate then going back in and deleting the sort of more brittle tests so that you're not constantly maintaining this big test suite?
So it is about getting a good balance, because of although you might characterization tests are brittle, they do have their place. For instance, as a very basic minimum for your website, you might want to make sure that every page that you go on isn't having a 500 error, or isn't got an error on it, and it's got the key important data. So you might always keep those there. It's just that you have to be aware that if you've got a lot of those, then that could require a lot of management. For instance, when you do a user interface rewrite. So having if you did a user interface rewrite, that would involve creating some sort of API, some sort of maybe a JSON API. You can write integration tests for that JSON API, and that's another level of making sure that nothing's broken in your system at the API level. And then you could have tests just for the front end, that if you mocked out the JSON API, make sure that given certain inputs, that the front end always displays the correct data and handles things in a certain way. But if you have a good balance of unit tests, integration tests, characterization tests, I think that's the best way to go about it, because you're more likely to catch bugs. But it's always about getting that balance, because you don't want to be working too hard.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
You mentioned about the problem of brittleness. Have you worked much with mocks? Because I find that mocks can be a solution to brittleness, in that they kind of, it's less about kind of asserting the data is at the end you expect, instead of asserting the kind of communications between the objects.
Yeah. So yeah, I have worked with mocks, and I agree with you. Sometimes it can promote a false sense of security that something's actually working. For instance, in the unit test that I actually showed you, I'll go to. You'll notice that I'm not actually mocking the database layer here. I've decided that, as you said there, that it's about the communication between your application layer and that database layer. And because I want to ensure that communication is correct, and making sure that I am getting return values from that, I'm actually using a database here to make sure that that's correct. And there are instances where I would use mocks, maybe I might use mocks for like an API that I had control of, or an internal API, and I would say, okay, I know what the response is. I don't want to spin up a container, or want to spin up a virtual server to test the API. I can just mock, because I know what the responses are most likely going to be. In that case, that would be a good way of mocking something. But say if I didn't own the server, so there's instances where I've been calculating tax for the company I work for. I don't own the tax API, or I don't own the tax processor that I'm using. So I'm gonna directly call a test API, specifically because I want to make sure that the code that I've written and the tests that I've written are communicating with the API correctly. Does that answer what your question?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of mocks because they enable tests to run quicker.
Yeah.
And almost the first objection of the development team is the test is slow. So for me, that's the big benefit of mocks. I mean, I think there's differing views about how much time you should spend testing other people's stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You know, anytime you put stuff through a database or an API that you don't know, sure enough, you may be kind of keeping an eye out for an incoming problem.
Yep.
And on the other hand, presumably you're tracking your versions.
Well,
you know, you would only change versions in a controlled way anyway.
I agree. It can be a good way. Like, say for instance, it was a big company, and you know that they're not going to you're mapping to a specific API version of an API that you're consuming, and you know it's not going to change because you trust the company. But there are instances, and speak to Dan after the talk about trusting other people's APIs. There's instances where the company will tell you that, and they'll say that here's some documentation for our API, it's really good, it works great, and then all of a sudden you'll start using it in the way that they're telling you to, and they've forgotten a field, or they're missing that you're meant to authenticate slightly differently here, and that happens all the time, and sometimes you don't want to mock that because if you just might not trust the person you're getting the data from, you just might not, and yes, it's going to be slower, but at the same time, at least it will be a good indication if something's broken on your end or on their end. Whereas if you're mocked, you might think that it's broke. It's not. Their end is fine, but in reality, it could be broken.
What's the support like for mocks in Codeception?
Well, Codeception on the underside of it is just PHP unit.
Right.
So under the hood it is, I'm pretty sure it extends PHP unit, and I sometimes like Codeception and I sometimes don't, depending on how I'm feeling. Just because of Codeception does require a lot of configuration, and it can require a lot of configuration, and sometimes that's a bit of a pain point. But recently I've been pretty happy with it because I feel like I've got a better understanding of what I'm trying to test, and sometimes it's not. I feel like it does solve the problem that it says it solves, which is managing your different types of tests and being able to run them all in the one application instead of having several test suites. You manage them together.
Yeah, I remember Codes. I haven't used it for a few years, but I remember it was great because you could very quickly set up like a Selenium test, a text browser test, and like a PHP unit test. You know, so you straight away get a variety of the type of tests hitting the system.
Yeah.
And it's all rolled up in one place, and I think it's a very good fit for what you're describing, which is a legacy application where you don't want to pour huge amounts of effort into getting your arms around it.
It can be, but like say for instance you're not testing a web browser, you're testing something dead custom like a SOAP server. Like that's going to require different types of testing, and you might be battling Codeception more and how its opinions of how to test things. You're better off just using PHP unit with your own little SOAP wrapper or SOAP test layer, and then just writing and running your tests that way. It really depends on your situation, but I do think for browser testing, this is really good. If I was doing it for user interface, so say I was consuming an API, I'd probably say, right, you use all the user interface tests. They should be running JavaScript. Like they shouldn't be running PHP. They shouldn't really be doing that because that's going to be slow anyway. And then have your integration tests that can be running using PHP or Codeception or whatever you choose.
Just a point for Codeception, you can write custom kind of client types, so you can add a bunch of different functions. So like I am testing a SOAP API and they see this XML or whatever. So it's quite flexible.
It is flexible, but I know at our place sometimes we have been battling with Codeception, so it's not all bells and whistles. There are some trade-offs in that you do have to configure it. But once you've got it configured and it's working, it can be really easy to test.
So you talked about getting the balance of sort of tests, like integration and unit tests and things, to try and sort of cover a system. Do you have any sort of guidelines for what kind of balance tends to cover a system well? And do you use statistics like code coverage at all in that?
I don't necessarily use code coverage, but I have worked on applications that do, and it can be a really good indication of whether you've covered you've got a good test coverage if you've covered all the bases. It's what Nick was saying earlier before the talk. He was saying that code coverage is good to say that your code's working, but really you want like business requirement coverage and scenario coverage to make sure that your code base is actually meeting business requirements. Because if I could be the best unit tester in the world and I could be making sure that every single edge case and every single code path is met, but if I haven't actually implemented a shopping cart and actually just implemented another type of application, then you know that all the time you spent writing the unit test is a waste of time. So going back to the balance, I do feel that characterization tests are really important for legacy systems because you need to know when you've broken something, you need to know when your system's regressed, and when something that previously was working is now not working. As you'll still want those characterization tests for a modern system, but you might not want as many because we've ran into problems right now is we've not got a legacy application, but we've got an application that has a lot of characterization tests, and they break a lot for numerous reasons, not just because of their characterization tests, but it does take a lot more time to manage using characterization tests. If you do make a lot of user interface changes, you are going to probably have to make changes to your characterization test, which is why I was talking about if you have a user interface layer and you're using a JSON API, it's probably best to use front-end tests and mock out that API and say, okay, I'm going to assume that I get this this set of data from this response and test it that way, so that you know if your system's broken or not. And that way you've got a bit of decoupling from your tests as well, because the characterization test is highly coupled to the whole application, your whole system. Whereas unit tests they just cover a small individual unit and they don't actually test the communication between individual units. And integration tests, they will test a group or a module. Does that can I answer your question or? Yeah, go on.
Sorry, I'm just aware of something that other people shop. We've got a large legacy web application.
Yeah.
It's been in development for 10 plus years.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a huge database, which a lot of the functionality is based around the database.
Yeah.
Most of our code was written by developers who don't know what unit tests are.
Yeah.
So most of it's not unit testing.
Right.
So it's very difficult for us to unit test things, and we've got a lot of reliance on the database.
Mm-hmm.
And we break stuff all the time. So we regress all the time.
Yeah.
So in order to try and fix this, my strategy's been try and encourage people to write a bunch of Selenium tests that are triggered by PHP unit and just test that at the very least the functionality that the users expect works.
Yeah.
We're using page objects at the moment.
Yeah.
I've never heard of codeception, but it sounds like that would help a lot and could potentially improve how efficiently we can get that goal of sort of reducing our regressions. But we've got a massive web application with so many modules, so many pages.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of time to write good Selenium tests that test all the various bits of functionality.
Mm-hmm.
Are you aware of any way to make it quicker and easier for people to write tests? Because essentially these characterization tests, which I've been calling regression tests, are essentially the same thing.
Yeah, they're the same thing.
Because they don't really care what's going on, it's just testing, does the expected thing happen? I would think maybe like a macro recorder, there's like Selenium IDE where you can click on things and record that.
Yeah.
Is that worth looking into for this? Have you ever tried anything like that to try and automate the generation of these tests? Or just really we want to try and get regression coverage for as much of our application as possible in as short space of time as possible.
You said you had a lot of modules. Is there any way of extracting one module, or do they all kind of talk to each other?
Pretty much everything's coupled on something.
Yeah. Then what you're saying, and actually, I don't know if I would go down the whole the macro route. I do think using codeception, it's not codeception that actually does the texting of the browser. It is like there's a Facebook WebDriver and there's other.
It's the Chrome driver that we've got.
Yeah, it's just like checking for specific elements on the page. Characterization tests do take a while to write. Like there's no getting around that, especially if the HTML or the pages load in certain ways. For instance, I've always had problems with I've had problems with in the past when you are using jQuery or Ajax to load something onto the page. You have to wait for that thing to specifically load before you can test. It's tough.
But there's no automated tools that you're aware of to sort of bring that.
Nah, there's for that type of system, there's no silver bullet. Like you're better off writing down the different scenarios. Maybe even look at tools like Bhat and write down the business scenarios, and then testing to ensure that the business, these businesses, well, they're called user stories, or these business requirements are met. But yeah, there's not like a silver bullet. Like if you've got a big legacy code base, it does take a long time to write each individual scenario. Sometimes it might be good trying to separate out the database layer and actually testing the interaction with the database, testing that, and making sure that you always receive the correct data from the database when you perform certain queries, testing it there. Maybe try and then, if you can see it's these database queries are used in multiple places that maybe they shouldn't be, try and consolidate them into the one place so that you're not always just relying on characterization tests and refactoring that way.
I'm curious, so when you run your Selenium tests against the application, are you using a production version of the application that has production access to the database, or are you using sort of a developer copy of the database that's being sanitized?
That's actually a really good point. You should never really you should try and avoid using production data. Production data can cause you to lose your job because of might decide to delete a load of things that you shouldn't have deleted. Like, say for instance,
I don't mean actually testing online, I just mean a copy of the database.
I haven't done it, but like I've read stories, and it does keep me up at night when I ever think about using a production database. But if you use a production-like database with production-like data, you should be able. Hopefully, you're able to cover as many edge cases in that database by creating really simple database structures. So, for instance, say you've got five database fields.
400 tables.
400 tables. See, that happens. We've got like thousands of tables because of how we've decided to structure our database.
We didn't decide.
No, sorry, how it was decided previously to structure our database. Yeah, sorry, that's an important fact. Thanks, Dan.
It's a support group, right?
Sometimes it is a support group, but like, it's trying to get the minimum amount of combinations of values in that database that you can then say, okay, I'll use that as my test data, and then will have to do test data management as well if you've got a large amount of data. So what really helps it can be to start thinking about how you can manage the test data, like using these tools like Factory Muffin or Factory Girl, and they allow you to generate fake data. And that can really help to make sure you're covering different edge cases. And then just try, it's really hard, but you just try and, you really do have to get a good amount of coverage and then make small changes, like try and make some really small changes separating out certain components so they're not coupled together. So a really good one is trying to decouple the database layer. So for instance, we've used a custom MySQL query library, a query class on top of our database layer, and that was used throughout the application, and it wasn't great. So we try and switch to Doctrine, and that's kind of helped and standardize how we're interacting with the database, and it's also easier to test as well.
Probably to expand on that point before, there is an easier way to do acceptance testing in a way. The BBC made a tool that does visual diffing of web pages, which is actually kind of horrific. So you put all your database stuff in there, then it essentially screenshots and diffs against a previous version. So if you change the codes, obviously it'll look different. I wouldn't recommend it. There's a reason we don't do it anymore. But
it could be useful though.
It's quick.
If you've got a lot of test data and you've got a good way of managing test data, like a diffing tool like that could be really quick and easy way to make sure that you've not broken or anything.
I'm curious to what's the name?
I can't remember. It's on BBC's GitHub. It's written in Ruby, but yeah, it's good to start with. But again, we moved on to Codeception. Then
so it will be that type of tool will be brittle. It will be able to break very easily.
Very brittle.
Sorry, I'm supposed to use an interface that hasn't been updated since 10 years ago. So.
You mentioned BHAT.
Yep.
There's one problem that Andrew's describing. I'm not working exactly the same area as he is, but is it the permutations, Andrew, that make it complicated to put these sets together?
It's just the sheer amount of functionality that we've implemented over 10 years and the amount of development resource that we've got to fix that.
It's just, doesn't BHAT encourage you to lump certain operations and you can then combine them? You know?
BHAT as far as I'm aware, is you being able to define your user stories.
Right.
And you're meant to write the user stories in a way that it doesn't care about implementation detail. It then uses these things called contexts. So you're able to write you can maybe write a in-memory context if you didn't want to worry about the browser. You could write an API context so that it only tests like as if it was an API. And if you don't have any implementation details, like if I click this button or if I see this particular error message on the page, if you don't use that terminology and you use like, as a user, when I add an item to the cart, I should see that that item has been added to the cart.
Right, but the point I'm making is if you've got a bhat script and it says, as a user, if I see an item in a cart, that the steps that are required to produce that situation, we could potentially reuse. Once you've written it once, then you can string it together multiple times. Because I think that's possibly part of the problem we're facing.
So to do
managing all the code necessary to get our system in the point where we can do our assertions. So
you will be able to reuse it, bearing in mind only if the front end interface is consistent. So say for instance you're using an add item to cart button on several pages, and as long as it's written in the same way or using a certain component, as in like it has the same ID in these contexts, it's got the same class, it's in the same position, then you will be able to extract that out in like page objects and as a certain you can actually like create that component in the context of bhat. But again, it really depends. You really have to make sure that it's mimicking the what's on the actual web page, and you have to make sure that if it's used in multiple places, as you were saying, you have to make sure it is actually the same.
So you talked about kind of doing tests to maintain business requirements and make sure they carry on, but how do you deal with business requirements that have been lost? So maybe like 3 years ago, Kevin worked with a client to do a feature, and then a year ago, Kevin left, and now no one knows about the feature, but it's still important to the client. Is there anything you can do to help uncover that?
So if you've got version control, I'm assuming Kevin was a developer, or you could maybe look up the version control system to see what that business requirement was. Because if you know it's lost, if you know that business requirement is lost, you'll have an idea of what it was in the first place. Is that the case in your scenario or in your?
I think scenarios both, where you don't know it's lost. It's just
Well, if you don't know it's lost, and the end users don't know it's lost, was it really needed? Was it really needed in the first place?
Or if the end users don't know, it's a problem, I guess. So,
yeah, because that's a separate issue. But sometimes you might be building something that's not actually needed, and when it does get lost and doesn't get used, you've just built something that's not needed. But sometimes if you're doing like agile development, sometimes you'll be talking to product owners and stakeholders, and they'll say they want this thing, but they might actually not want it. They just think they want it, which is fine. That's perfectly fine. But you have to understand that by using like Google Analytics and analyzing what parts of your system actually gets used, and seeing if it is being lost and we previously had it and it's lost and no one's really noticed for 3 years, you might have to question whether it's that important in the first place.
But I guess I was more asking the other way around. So if it turns out it was important to the client, but you as a company, you've just forgotten that.
Well then,
it's a forum, right?
Yeah, and yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, you might. Well, actually, that's not true because you might say, "Oh, yeah, we've lost this feature," and then they'll be like, "What do you mean you've fucking lost the feature? How did you lose it? Why is it not there anymore? How come you don't even know what my feature is?"
We've genuinely had situations like that where features have gone missing and either us or the customer can remember what they are.
Yeah, it happens, but like.
I think 6 months was the longest that we had before somebody realised something had gone.
Yeah, it does happen. When you've got large code bases, it's got to be expected, but like it's just I think if you have tests and no one just randomly deletes some of your tests, that might help. Or if you've got good documentation as well, like as in like if you've got BHAT's scenarios are quite good documentation, but also just like you might just want it on. We use Confluence for documentation. It can be quite good just saying, well, what is the purpose of this this actual system? What's the purpose of this service? What's it actually doing? What's it trying to achieve? And getting people that aren't necessarily developers, but people that are interested in the business value, helping you to write that documentation really helps with you as a developer understanding what you're building, but also with if you need to look why this was implemented in the first place. You can read it there. We're all good? Okay. Cheers, guys. You've been great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's a small gift for you.
Oh, awesome.
Talk. Thank you. And who does the So, okay. No problem. So today we have a raffle for a T-shirt and the usual JetBrains voucher. If you can mix this up a bit and pick one.
272.
Hey.
Nice one.
Congrats. I'll come around in a moment. So, well, thank you for the talk. Thank you guys for coming. I don't know if there's anything left, but help yourself. Feel free to chat, and I hope to see you next time. We are looking for the speakers, so I hope to see some emails. There's a website, glasgowphp.co.uk, where you can actually submit your talk proposal. And there's Slack, obviously you can get in touch on Slack with us as well. Next month I think we'll be at Markup. Either Markup or in Vita. So check the